We are transitioning into our next section, and then we'll move into lunch after that. So our first speaker in our building resilience section is Kim Davis, and she's going to be talking to us about post-fire regeneration in a changing climate. So Kim, it's all yours.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to be here, and I think some of what I'm going to share, yeah, you can move on to the next slide. I guess I should say I work for the Rocky Mountain Research Station based in Missoula at the Fire Sciences Lab here for the Forest Service. Yeah, so I was asked to talk about my work with post-fire regeneration and climate change, which I think is maybe not new to anybody. And in fact, many of the people in this room were actually collaborators and co-authors on this project. But I'll just go over quickly some of the results we found, and especially because this data is the data that feeds into the Regen Mapper tool. And so basically we got together a group of about 60 collaborators, so I didn't have space to list them all. But because we had such a big group, we were able to get data from over 10,000 field plots of post-fire conifer regeneration density by species. So these cross big biophysical gradients and allowed us to create models of post-fire regeneration for all of these species that are listed combined, as well as each individual species. And look at things like post-fire climate, average climate, fire severity, seed availability, all the things we know that are important, but we're hoping to kind of look at the relative importance of the two main factors, next slide, that we know are important, which are seed availability and also climate conditions. And so these relationships between species, this is for the all species model, but recruitment probability and distance to seed source is not surprising to anybody here. But then we also saw, the tree cover that survived the fire in the 300 meters around the plot was also really important. So abundance of seed as well as distance to seed was a key driver. And then finally, we also saw this relationship we would expect based on lots of other work that people have done with climatic water deficit, which popped out as one of the most important climate drivers for us, where we had an interaction between mean annual deficit, like 30-year climatology, so average site conditions, and then the post-fire climate. So what I'm showing on the x-axis there is the hottest or the highest deficit of any of the first 5 years post-fire. So was there one really hot and dry year? And if there was, if you at our average sites, which are shown there in the green line, or our really dry sites, which are shown in the orange line, we saw much lower rates of recruitment. And our wetter sites seem to be kind of buffered from the effects of post-fire climate, which just suggests that as it's getting drier on average, of course, the effects of post-fire climate will become more important in some of our currently kind of moister sites. Next slide. What we also found, which I thought was pretty interesting to see at kind of this coarse, like west-wide scale, was the importance of this interaction between either fire severity, which is what I'm showing here for our Douglas fir specific model, or tree cover, which was important for some other species like subalpine fir or grand fir and white fir, I believe. But there's this interaction where if you have trees left on the landscape, the post-fire climate didn't matter as much. And so this is just highlighting how it's not just that those trees on the landscape are providing seed, they also buffer the microclimate conditions. And so there's been some work showing that the surface temperatures and VPD can be really high in these areas that burn at high severity. And so if you have canopy left on the landscape, that's going to help buffer some of the fluctuations in climate that you might see in the years following the fire. Next slide. And so we use these models to make these projections across the West under climate change, under a low severity and a high severity scenario. And so the reason we did this was to try to understand, kind of the relative importance of seed availability, which is represented by those fire severity scenarios, and the impacts of changing climate over time. And so the high severity scenario had 150 meters to a seed source, 10% canopy cover surrounding the area, as well as like a high satellite derived index of fire severity. And the low severity, we had distance to seed source was 10 meters, and there was 30% tree cover in the surrounding landscape. And so you'll notice, as you would expect, as you move through time, we see a lot more red on the landscape, especially in the areas burned at high severity. But what you'll also notice is the difference between the top row and the bottom row is even larger than the changes that we would expect to see over time due to climate change. And so we saw this as hopeful message that, at least we have some agency to try to do things before the fire, not just reforestation, but thinking about what we can do before the fire to reduce fire severity, keep trees on landscape, which is, I think, a cool way that Planscape, which is already thinking about fuel treatments, can kind of link the fuel treatment and post-fire restoration thoughts. But then this also highlights, the importance, the opportunity for reforestation in many areas. And then another thing I think it really highlights is that this course climate data, which was 4-kilometer resolution, is not helpful for planning, like at the scale of a project unit. We don't expect there to be no regeneration anywhere in Arizona, for example. And it's just highlighting the importance of when you are in those parts of the country that have a lot of red, identifying like Zach was talking about, the topoclimate or the microclimate that will be most suitable for regeneration, because the kind of macro scale conditions are not very suitable. Next slide. And one last thing I want to touch on quickly is that the model that I'm showing in the bottom row now, that's still the low severity scenario for the all species model. But when we look at species specific projections, we really see differences. And so I think it's important when we're making these models to try and identify areas that will or won't have regeneration to incorporate the different species. So the Ponderosa model on the top shows much higher probability of regeneration in Arizona specifically. Next slide. And so, what I found over years of working on post-fire regen is that water deficit and then surface temperature, like Zach has talked about, are consistently the best predictors in this project and other projects I've worked on across kind of species and regions. And I know there's some work showing in California that precipitation is best, but I guess in other parts of the West, like water deficit has really popped out. Surrounding tree cover matters not just for seedability, but also for its effect on microclimate. And we really need that high resolution climate data that incorporates topography so that we can find those spots where we might be most likely to have successful either regeneration or survival if we're planting trees. Next slide. And then I would say one thing that limits some of the models that we use is our ability, like Zach said, to accurately map post-fire canopy cover. And so just using like fire severity, for example, is not necessarily reflective of if there's a single tree that survived the fire, which can really have a big impact on whether or not you have natural regen. So this is showing like 1 or 2 live larch that are just surrounded by regeneration. And so better high resolution mapping of like single trees that survive a fire could really help in these projections. And that's all I have.
Thanks, Kim. Appreciate you being here and taking the time to present. We're going to keep rolling through. So let's do that. And then we can kind of circle back and see how folks are feeling if we want to take additional questions towards lunchtime. Up next, we have Malcolm North, and he's going to be talking to us about using the natural range of variability and climatic water deficit to estimate climate adjusted planting densities. All yours, Malcolm.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about a fairly simple idea here, but I think something that's pretty fundamental in how we rethink what we do with reforestation and gets to the very basic question of how many trees do you actually put in the ground, and why would we want to adjust the levels of density that we plant at. Next slide, please. So it's really based on 2 different pieces of work that I've worked on before. One was a paper suggesting that reforestation needs to consider more resilience factors in the way it reforests areas, and in particular that a lot of the particular notions about planting at high density and then adjusting that density with re-entry, there's a lack of money often and personnel to be able to do that. And the second paper that builds into this conversation has to do with the idea of what exactly is resilience in these frequent fire forests. And to give you a context of what we're talking about here, the photos on the right-hand side give you a sense of what these forests may have looked like historically versus in the present. But I also want to point out that at least in California and in Region 5, the table at the bottom of the slide shows what are the suggested planting or trees per acre planting for different forest types, both between the recommended TPA, the minimum trees per acre, and then the historic range of trees per acre that used to exist in these forests when there was frequent fire. And you'll notice quite a discrepancy in that last column compared to the first two. Next slide, please. So why does low density matter? I'm going to suggest that for several reasons. One of them, I think that Solomon Dabrowski will touch on later and that we've already mentioned several times, is there's an incredible limited seed availability for the foreseeable future to replant the vast acreage, the estimated 4 million acres that have been burned at high severity in the West. But there's also a real point, I think, in trying to maintain low densities, both for greater fire resilience as well as climate resilience. So the top left picture shows a traditional planting approach that's fairly high density in a regular pattern, and the bottom shows a similar type of system, but starting with an initial kind of clump pattern and how that progresses. The final slides in both the right-hand column of those show how these different stand structures react to fire when fire does burn through them. But the other point, which I think really gets to the heart of what is resilience in these systems, has to do with the relative density and the environment that these plants evolved in. And what the paper, or the operational resilience paper, suggests is that because of the frequency of fire in these systems, most of these forests historically had very low levels of competition. And that's what this right-hand figure with a paired violin plot shows, what the relative stand density index was in 1911 versus 2012. And you can see the way the violin pattern actually flips or becomes inverted. You've had a fundamental shift between most forests being in a condition of free of competition or partial competition to a condition of full occupancy or imminent mortality, which does seem to be associated with a real reduction in the resilience of these stands to be able to fend off particularly drought and bark beetle stresses. I would note that Planscape currently uses relative SDI as one assessment of forest resilience. Next slide, please. So finally, what does all this lead to, and what should we build? I'm going to suggest that one option that we consider and that Planscape considers is developing planting targets, or TPAs, trees per acre, based on historical densities. But I'm not trying to reinvent the past. I will believe that those densities need to be adjusted for where climate is taking these conditions. And I'm going to suggest that we can figure out at least a general ballpark way of estimating that adjustment using climatic water deficit, both in present and future conditions. Why climatic water deficit? Well, I'm going to argue, particularly since I'm going to use an economic formula here to make this adjustment, that economics is very good at being able to adjust fungible commodities such as money, but in Western forest systems, what is basically the equivalent of money is water, and water runs most of these systems. As Kim was just pointing out, climatic water deficit is a key variable in how many trees you can support in an area. So I'm going to suggest a three-step type of process that the Planscape group considers. Is that first, you can estimate what the historical densities were in different forest types. There's a whole series of these publications put out by Region 5 Ecology Program. And you'll notice that here I'm going to use an example in each one of these phases, that mixed conifer used to have a natural range of variation that averaged out to about 64 trees per acre. You borrow an economic formula which deals with rates of how to adjust currency values depending on rates of inflation and particularly limited resource commodities, in this case water. And you can take that 64 trees per acre and adjust it and in this case, I'm using a climatic water deficit of 500 moving to 700 in the future. That would drop that 64 trees per acre to 38 trees per acre. And then you need to add in the fact of what you would roughly estimate the mortality rate to be of the seedlings that you plant. Again, the paper that Kim was suggested over a large area with, I think, something like 10,000 trees sampled, they had about 20% mortality. That's fairly similar to what we've seen in a lot of California, 20 to 25%. So we build in or increase that 38 trees per acre accounting for mortality, and you end up with 48 trees per acre versus the current recommended total by the Forest Service of 150 to 200 trees per acre. The simple math suggests that you could increase the amount of acreage planted by 3 to 4 times if we started initially planting at densities that are consistent with both the frequent fire regime that these forests produce, where competition was minimized and that the system was actually fairly well adapted or robust to stresses like drought, bark beetles, and fire. Thank you.
We do have a question online. Joe Stewart asked, does this framework assume no assisted gene flow? Would a climate matching approach for transferring NRV-based planting density work?
Yeah, it does not take into account gene flow or any of the solutions that Jessica was mentioning about assisted migration. There are ways, this is a very rough initial way of trying to get at the density levels, and I think we could certainly make this a lot more sophisticated. But either way that you look at this, you're talking about densities that are using about 1/3 to 1/4 the number of trees that are currently planted out there. And so factoring in something like this could dramatically change the amount of acreage that we have that we could plant. And as Solomon's going to go into in more detail, I think we're going to find that the pipeline for providing seedlings is grossly mismatched for what the demand is these days.
Thanks.
Yeah, another question. Jason Mohagadas asked if at 38 PPA would brush become an issue? Seems at higher density you can use shade to manage brush.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. There's a lot of kind of belief in the civicultural community that shrubs are evil. And I know Matt Hurto in his lab has been doing some really great work suggesting that particularly as conditions become more stressful, that there's actually a facilitation effect going on. And I'm going to suggest that shrubs actually have a beneficial role in these systems as long as their coverage is not too high to both be modifying microclimate for seedlings becoming established, and frankly also as a heat sink if you're going to put prescribed fire into these stands to reduce their density and manage them in the future as well.
Thanks, Malcolm. We're going to press on, and we have, as an honor, I think, our first in-person speaker. So I will pass it over to Jim Thorne, who's going to talk to us about a spatial triage method to guide climate adaptive cone crop harvests. And you've got full control over.
Okay, well, 7 minutes and I'm between you and lunch. So, okay, here we go. Basically, this is a tool that was designed for, oh, how do I advance? Oh, I hit return? Oh.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. It's a tool to support nursery operations. So imagine the nursery operators sitting there and they're trying to figure out what seed lot to use for the assisted migration or what combination. And they're also trying to figure out where to send people to go get seed. And so this is a very simple tool that allows for a triage to identify high-risk areas across the range of a species from climate or from high intensity wildfire and intersects it with seed zone and elevation bands and operational considerations. So we've scraped about, I don't know, it's closing on 2 million points in California, plus many verified maps. And here is the range of ponderosa pine, one of 5 species we've done this for. We're doing it for about 20 to 30 more at this point. And I can tell you that, okay, 62,457 square kilometers, that's the range of ponderosa in California. We can drop that on the seed zone elevation bands, let's call those SEBs. And then we can, so we can tell, oh, there's 2 kilometers of pondo in this SEB, and the whole of another SEB is completely full of it. And we could use other spatial units if we wanted to. And then we could come in and say, okay, let's build models of high intensity fire risk based off of fire return interval departure or any other metric that you want for showing the amount of fuel that has accumulated, because that could wipe out a stand. And we can also use methods that I've developed over the last 6 or 7 years that are place-based to say within the range, what are the parts of the range that experience or will experience high future climate stress? So similar to what Kim was talking about. And so here on the left are the seed zone elevation bands by 2,000 foot intervals, and the red, brown, purple are the ones that move into high stress conditions at different 30-year steps from current out to 2100. And we can map that both in terms of like the red and blue that you saw in Kim's talk, or we could map it in terms of time. And so the central map is showing us at what time do the SEBs that have pondo in them, in the pondo range, move into high climate stress, including climatic water deficit, over time. And you can see that, not surprisingly, there's an upslope movement of that in the Sierra. That's something that we've actually observed first in 2005. The map on the right-hand side was the loss of lower elevation pondo that I first built a map back then to see. So we can take the risk factors, those being high intensity wildfire and climate change in different time periods for high risk, and we can map those together. We can combine them. And then we can say, oh, well, the nursery has 3 objectives themselves. We're working with the LAMRC, the LA Moran nursery in California, and we have their inventory. We actually created the first digital version of that inventory from cardboard stock. And so we know how many seed there are by different species. We know what the goal is by SEB for each one, and we know where the demand is coming from. So that's the center image, is those 3 things combined, and then we can combine all of those. And when we look at them in the paper we just put out, we found that there was very poor match between the targeting locations for seed and the high risk profile SEBs. And so maybe not surprisingly, in Southern California, we're missing out on seeds that might have valuable genetic source, and we're going and collecting them from other places. So then how do we further inform this to get the people who are driving pickup trucks and trying to go get seed? Well, you can bring this in, and it's essentially a tabular formation. So the table you see here has the fire risk ranking by SEB and the climate risk, and combined the 3 operational categories. It's an open system, so you could put other categories in there and rank the landscape for those, or you could say, hey, I'm not interested in climate, I just want to look at the fire risk, and you can resort it very easily based on that. So it's a fast and easy way to identify seed zones that could be targeted for individual species. Then you bring that into a map form, and so here we're looking at a place in Southern California, and there's immediately already highly stressed and moving into highly stressed by 2040 in the clear and the tan. We drop the roads over that. We buffer them by 100 meters so that you can be scouting for seed off the dirt roads. And we bring in imagery to see, are those trees still there, so that if you're sending somebody out there, you're not sending them out to a negative point, a point that doesn't have trees anymore. And that's why we're using the existing range of the species for this application, rather than a probability distribution for where species might occur. So, okay, how does this tie into the reforestation? There's the cone survey, and I would say that that first little box of people, that's the application that I'm looking at. The seedling and seed orders, that's the genetic component, and much of the planting, like what Malcolm was just talking about, would be up there at number 10. But I think that even this cycle, which is a nice graphic from the LAMRC CAL FIRE, is not observing everything. That managing the green and the black on the landscape means that we should be looking at the whole forest life cycle, and that we should be, so what do we know? I think that an adaptive management operation can be updated using open data architecture. So remote sensing, ecological climate forecasts, forest demographics, biogeographic, and other types of data can be incorporated into the system as they come. I got you there. And I really think that we need to be thinking about resist, adapt, and transform. So I'm hearing a lot about the restoration part of this, and part of this needs to be transformation because we're seeing it. And there's lots of interesting pilots that are going with regards to the species composition at different locations. So better dynamic and spatially explicit landscape species planting palettes to guide a resist, adapt, transform strategy and decisions is what I think we are looking for. Oh, and now it's lunchtime, right?
Well, you did an amazing job with time, so thank you. Not that everybody has done an absolutely spectacular job with time, so thank you guys so much. I recognize that I have been kind of driving that at a very hard pace, so thank you for bearing with me on that. Speaker video is off. Thank you, Charlie. So, Charlie, no questions online?
Not for this one.
Okay. Any questions in the room for Jim? Okay. I'm going to deviate a little bit here. So we do have about an hour and a half for lunch. And for those of us who are sticking around, it's, we have lunch that is offered. So what I would like to do is see if you guys would be willing to stick around for another couple of minutes so that we can address the questions that haven't been asked yet, so that we can hear those as a group. So is everybody okay with sticking around for a couple of more minutes before you get to go eat? I will say that is a mostly resounding yes. So thank you all. I appreciate it. So I know I'm going to go look back at notes here. We did have a couple of questions for Tom and for Brian and for Jessica. So I want to make sure that there are opportunities for those folks to get their questions answered, but also just open it up a little bit more for general questions for anybody that's spoken so far this morning. So go for it, Matt.
All right, thanks. So this is for Brian and Jessica primarily. So thinking about, and particularly Brian, thinking about one of the challenges we see in Region 3 is the Forest Service is pretty heavily constrained by the Forester's Handbook and the seed source guidance, right? So there's the seed zones and stuff like that. And I see that as a real impediment to actually implementing some of this stuff on the landscape. And I'm wondering, do you have a workaround for that in Region 6?
Well, so this actually kind of goes back to one of the questions that Brian pointed out in the chat too, which is there with the revision to the silviculture manual, there's a lot more clear guidance on operationally implementing assisted population migration. And so some of those hurdles of the unclear language are hopefully not going to be as much of an issue. But I guess it's the vagary of the, or like the vagueness of the wording that has caused the difference in response to how assisted population migration has been perceived and implemented. The way with the new wording, at the very least, one of the pretty key changes is if there is evidence for climate mismatch, it is actually suggested to implement population migration in those areas. And so I think what's going to be key in the next year or two as that gets rolled out is carrying out analyses that target which are the areas that have changed the most quickly and have evidence of maladaptation, and using those types of analyses to guide our operational assisted population migration efforts. And I think that's a good thing to do even in the absence of that language. And so that's something that we've just now started to carry out in Region 6. And it looks like from some of these talks here, there's quite a lot of work being done in that regard in Region 5 too. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's
Awesome. Any follow-ups? Okay, great. I know we have a couple in the chat, so Charlie, would you mind? And actually, folks, if you guys want to, you can come off mute and just chime in.
Yeah, I think that might work better. So
Okay.
Jason and Kyle Rodman both have questions or comments.
Great, Jason, go for it.
Thanks. Just a quick question. I think we have the ability to figure out where to put stuff and prioritize, but I didn't see, do any of the models consider the cost of reforestation? You know, it increases over time, sort of time since fire, it's more expensive. And then whether or not the areas you're prioritizing already have NEPA or CEQA in place to actually do the reforestation work. Because that usually, those NEPA docs, we're working on the Dixie fire right now, and we're 3 years out still from the actual fire. So that can add a lot of time. But are those two factors considered anywhere yet?
Was anyone thinking, Zach, if you still around, Kyle, Joe, anyone else might have some thoughts on that? Solomon?
If Kim or Zach are not going to respond, or if they're not available, I know that those models that are utilized within Region Mapper at least have a time since fire component to it. So yes, in terms of modulating the probability of regeneration.
And I believe at this point, Regen Mapper also has a cost benefit analysis component to it as well, but I don't think that there's anyone that actually directly incorporates cost to my knowledge, but somebody please correct me if I'm wrong.
Based on this.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, and then I think there was one other one.
Yeah, and I don't have, this was a response to the previous comment, Libby, but I was just going to add that sometimes the staffing limitations really tie our hands and slow down the process, right? And so the geneticist position in Region 3 is a really good example of that, of where I think the regional office folks do actually want to change some of that guidance, and a lot of local forests are pushing for that as well. But the fact that there's not a geneticist in place, they want to make sure that they have kind of the subject expert making the decision for the region. So, you know, it's an interesting issue, and it's a complicated one.
I wanted to add one thing really quickly, that I think it's also really different across the country. If you're thinking a national level in terms of reforestation, that is, Brian and I in the West, we definitely have a lot of topography. And so doing assisted migration or assisted gene flow in California, it's, you know, the Forest Service has one seed bank. You can change elevations and get very different climate adapted seeds, you know, just by going up and down hill 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet. And we're not changing states or jurisdictions. Whereas towards farther east, to do this climate matching, a lot of times you're going definitely, you know, across state lines and very large geographic areas to match those climates. So I think how we think about it in different parts of the country, I think needs to be very different. But it's definitely an issue. I think that's a part of why different regions will need to approach it differently.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm going to pivot from online really quickly and come back to you guys in a second, but I do want to let folks in the room ask any questions that they might have too. think we're starting to get to the point where I can smell lunch. So let's do one more question. It looks like from Tom, and then we'll break for lunch. So thanks for being patient through the question portion of this all through.
Yeah, associated with costs, my question is, what kind of documents do we have associated with project success? I've gone to sites in which the success has been absolutely abysmal. And if you figure the cost of planting, it could be pretty low. But once you figure in the cost of high mortality or it just doesn't work, the cost goes up exponentially because you didn't really get much for your money. So how much do we really know about our failures? My opinion is that a lot of people simply don't report them because it looks bad. And so, but it's a real issue in figuring cost.
I think I mean, if anybody has anything to add to that, yes, yeah. Yeah, I don't think that we have a good sense of that. And I think, you know, we're going to hear a little bit from Paula Fornwall after lunch, who I think, and, you know, a lot of this seedling survival and monitoring can get to some of those pieces around what that actually looks like in terms of the survival pieces. But I think there is a really great opportunity here to start tying together some of that monitoring information with the cost to help us better understand where those pieces lie. So, thanks for that point, Tom, and appreciate that you're bringing that up. With that, I am going to ask that we press pause on this, and for virtual folks, we'll be resuming at 1:15 after lunch. So we'll put you on mute and turn off the cameras for a little bit and resume to talk a little bit about seedling survival and monitoring after the break. Thanks all.